Blood dripped from Parker Lawson's knuckles as he stared down at the unconscious man sprawled in the mud outside Florence's only saloon, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on his broad shoulders. The year was 1878, and like the untamed territory around him, Parker's rage remained barely contained beneath a veneer of cold control. The onlookers who had gathered to witness the fight now dispersed, no one daring to meet his eye as he flexed his injured hand and turned toward his horse. "That's the third man this month you've put down, Lawson," Sheriff Adams called from the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his belt. "One day you're gonna kill somebody." Parker didn't answer. He untied his chestnut mare from the hitching post, mounted in one fluid motion, and rode out of town without a backward glance. The townsfolk of Florence had learned to give the scarred rancher a wide berth in the 4 years since his return from the war that had ended a decade ago, but still raged inside him. The 15-mile ride back to his ranch gave Parker time to settle his thoughts. The Broken Arrow wasn't much a modest spread south of the Gila River with a small herd of cattle, a sturdy cabin, and a reputation for being unwelcoming to visitors. It was enough for one man who preferred solitude to company. As the cabin came into view, Parker slowed his mare. Something was different. Smoke curled from the chimney, though he'd left no fire burning that morning. He reached for the Winchester rifle in his saddle holster, approaching cautiously. A woman stood on his porch, her honey gold hair catching the late afternoon light. She wore a plain blue dress, dusty from travel, and when she turned toward him, her face was streaked with tears. "Mr. Lawson." Her voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "I'm Willow Tucker. Your brother James sent me." Parker felt the old familiar ache in his chest at the mention of his brother's name. "James is dead, madam, has been for 3 years. The woman Willow nodded. "Yes, that's why I'm here." She held out a sealed letter. "He asked me to deliver this if anything happened to him." Parker dismounted, keeping a safe distance. "How'd you get in my house?" The door was unlocked. "I've been traveling for days and She faltered, swaying slightly. Despite his suspicion, Parker moved forward quickly to catch her arm before she collapsed. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her face. She couldn't have been more than 25, with eyes the color of sage after rain. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked gruffly. "Yesterday, I think." She tried to stand straight, pulling away from his touch. "I'm not here for charity, Mr. Lawson. I made a promise to your brother, and I intend to keep it." Parker hesitated. No one had set foot in his home in years except for the occasional ranch hand he hired during calving season. He didn't want company, especially not a woman who brought reminders of James. But the sun was setting, and Florence was too far to send her back tonight. "Come in, then. You can explain while you eat." He tethered his horse and followed her inside, uncomfortable in his own home with a stranger present. The cabin was spare but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to bedrooms. James had built most of the furniture before he'd left to seek his fortune in the silver mines near Tombstone. Willow had indeed started a fire and put on a pot of coffee. The familiar scent mingled with something unfamiliar, a trace of lavender that clung to her despite her travels. Parker gestured for her to sit while he sliced bread and cheese, setting it before her with jerky and dried apples. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, pushing one toward her. "Eat first, then talk." She didn't need to be told twice, eating with the restrained hunger of someone who'd known lean times but retained their dignity. Parker watched her, noting the calluses on her hands. This wasn't a pampered city woman. When she'd finished, she withdrew the letter from her pocket, smoothing it on the table. "Your brother saved my life 3 years ago in Prescott. I was working as a school teacher when a fire broke out. He carried 3 children to safety and then came back for me when the roof started collapsing." Parker's jaw tightened. It sounded like James always the hero. "We became friends," she continued. "He spoke of you often, said his older brother was the bravest man he knew, but that the war had taken something from you he couldn't help you find again." "James talked too much," Parker said flatly. "Always did." Willow's eyes flashed. "He loved you. Even when you pushed everyone away, he never gave up on you." "And yet he died alone in a mining accident rather than come home," Parker replied, the bitterness he thought he'd buried rising again. "He wasn't alone," Willow said quietly. "I was with him when it happened. That's why he gave me this letter and made me promise to bring it to you if—" She swallowed hard. The support beams gave way. James pushed me clear, but he couldn't save himself. Parker stared at the unopened letter, his brother's handwriting achingly familiar on the envelope. "Why wait 3 years to deliver it? I tried to come sooner. I was badly injured in the collapse. It took months to recover, and by then, I'd lost everything. I've been working my way here ever since, taking jobs where I could find them." Parker's eyes narrowed. "And now that you're here, now I fulfill my promise and leave you in peace," she said, rising from the table. "I can make my way back to town at first light." Parker stood as well, towering over her. "It's 15 miles of rough country and you're exhausted. You'll stay the night. James's room is through there." He nodded toward the second bedroom. "It's been empty since he left. Thank you." She hesitated, then pushed the letter toward him. "He would want you to read it." Parker left the letter on the table, untouched. "Get some rest, Miss Tucker." He escaped to the porch, needing air that didn't smell of lavender and memories. The night sky spread above him, stars scattered like broken glass across black velvet. He lit a cigarette, letting the smoke curl around him as he considered the unwelcome guest who'd brought the past to his doorstep. After an hour, he returned inside. The letter still lay on the table, but Willow had cleared away the dishes and banked the fire. The door to James's room was closed. Parker picked up the letter, turning it over in his scarred hands. With a muttered curse, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "Parker," it began in his brother's familiar scrawl. "If you're reading this, I've gone to meet Ma and Pa. Don't waste time grieving for me. I lived the life I chose. But I worry I'll die with one regret, that I couldn't help you find your way back from the darkness that's been eating at you since the war. You were always the strong one. When Pa died and we lost the farm, you held what was left of our family together. You went to war believing in something. You came back believing in nothing, and I've watched you build walls around yourself ever since." The woman who brings this letter is Willow Tucker. She's the finest person I've ever known, brave, honest, stubborn as a mule. She lost her family in the war too, but she hasn't let it turn her heart to stone. I'm asking you, brother, for one last favor. Willow has no one left. Give her a place to stay for a while. Maybe you can help each other find what you've both lost. Remember what Ma used to say, a Lawson faces trouble standing up. I've watched you stand against everything life has thrown at you, but there's a difference between standing and living. Start living again, Parker. Your brother, always, James. Parker folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch yard, wondering what his brother had been thinking. James had always been an optimist, even when life gave him no reason to be. He glanced toward the closed door of the second bedroom. A stranger sleeping under his roof, bringing complications he didn't want. At first light, he'd give her provisions and send her on her way. James's last request be damned. Morning came with the pale gold light that preceded the desert heat. Parker had barely slept, making his usual rounds of the property at dawn to check on the cattle and the single horse in the corral besides his mare, A mule Willow had arrived on, now contentedly munching hay. When he returned to the cabin, he found Willow already up, dressed in the same travel-worn blue dress, her hair neatly braided. She'd made coffee and was frying bacon in his cast-iron skillet. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "Seemed the least I could do for your hospitality." "You didn't need to cook," he replied gruffly, pouring himself coffee. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 16, Mr. Lawson. I don't expect to be waited on." She slid eggs into the pan next to the bacon. "Did you read the letter?" Parker nodded once, not meeting her eyes. James always did see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves, she agreed quietly. They ate in uncomfortable silence, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound besides their utensils against the plates. When they finished, Parker pushed back his chair. "I can spare some supplies for your journey. There's a stage that comes through Florence on Thursdays. It'll take you wherever you're heading next." Willow set down her coffee cup carefully. "I'm not heading anywhere yet, Mr. Lawson. I promised James I'd deliver his letter and make sure you were all right. From what I can see, you're surviving, but I'm not convinced you're all right." Parker's face hardened. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're a man who keeps his distance from everyone. I know you've got scars that go deeper than the one on your face." She nodded toward the jagged mark that ran from his right temple to his jaw. "And I know James loved you and worried about you until his dying day. And you think staying here will somehow honor his memory?" Parker's voice was cold. "This is no place for a woman alone. I live here because I prefer solitude. I don't need or want company." "I'm not asking to stay forever," she replied evenly. "Just long enough to fulfill my promise to James. I can earn my keep. I'm not afraid of hard work. There's nothing for you here." "There's nothing for me anywhere," she said simply. "I've lost everyone I ever cared about, my parents to the war, my brother to typhoid, and James to that mine. I'm not looking for charity or romance, Mr. Lawson. Just a temporary place while I decide what comes next." Parker studied her face, searching for deceit or manipulation, finding only exhausted determination. Something about her stubborn chin reminded him of James. "2 weeks," he said finally. "You can stay 2 weeks, then you move on." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This isn't a charity either. If you stay, you work. I've got a herd that needs tending, fences that need mending, and more chores than I can handle alone. I told you I'm not afraid of work. We'll see." He stood, reaching for his hat. "I need to ride the north pasture. There's a creek there where the cattle water. The fence keeps breaking and they wander onto Harding's property. He's threatened to shoot any stray that crosses his land." "I could come with you," she offered. "Help with the fence." Parker hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Can you ride?" "Since I was a child." "Then saddle up. We've got work to do." Within half an hour they were riding north across the sun-baked land, Willow on her mule, wearing a pair of James's old trousers and a shirt Parker had given her, both too large but more practical than her dress for ranch work. She'd pinned up her braid under a wide-brimmed hat, protection against the merciless Arizona sun. Parker rode slightly ahead, aware of her presence behind him like an itch between his shoulder blades. It had been so long since he'd shared his days with anyone that the simple act of conversation felt like a skill he'd forgotten. They reached the creek by mid-morning. Sure enough, several sections of fence had been trampled by the cattle seeking water. Parker dismounted, tethering his mare to a sturdy juniper, and began unloading tools from his saddlebags. Willow joined him without being asked, taking hammers and wire cutters as he handed them to her. "What happened here?" Flash flood last month washed out part of the bank. "The cattle push through the weak spots to get to the water. I've repaired it twice already, but it keeps happening." She surveyed the damage thoughtfully. Maybe instead of fixing the same fence in the same place, we should build a new section farther back from the bank. Parker frowned. It was a logical suggestion, but it irked him that she'd spotted the solution so quickly. That would take more materials than I brought. We could start today by salvaging what we can, then come back tomorrow with more supplies, she suggested. I noticed you have lumber and wire in the barn. Without answering, Parker began working on the broken fence, hammering a post back into the ground with more force than necessary. Willow watched him for a moment, then silently began gathering the scattered pieces of wire and wood. They worked side by side for hours, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. Parker was surprised by Willow's strength and efficiency. She didn't complain about the heat or the difficult work, didn't chatter needlessly or ask personal questions. She simply did what needed doing, occasionally offering suggestions that, though he was reluctant to admit it, were sensible. By mid-afternoon, they'd done all they could with the materials at hand. Parker stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. It'll hold for now. We'll come back tomorrow and finish. Willow nodded, pushing damp strands of hair from her face. Her skin had flushed from exertion and sun, but her eyes were bright with the satisfaction of physical labor well done. There's a shady spot upstream where we can rest before heading back, Parker found himself saying. The water's clean enough to drink there. She followed him to a stand of cottonwoods that offered blessed shade. They watered the horses and themselves, then sat on the grassy bank, the burble of the creek filling the silence between them. This is beautiful land, Willow said after a while. I can see why you and James loved it. Parker stared across the water, remembering. We camped here when we first came to Florence before we built the cabin. James was 15, full of big ideas about the ranch we'd build. He wanted to raise horses, not cattle. He told me, Willow said with a small smile. He said you were the practical one, always thinking about what would sell rather than what you loved. Cattle are steadier than horses, less heartbreak. Is that why you still have his colt in your corral, the sorrel with the white star? Parker's head snapped up. How did you know that was James's horse? He described Lightning to me once, said the colt was the finest horse he'd ever trained, and that you'd promised to look after him if anything happened. Parker felt the familiar tightness in his chest. James talked too much. He missed you. Willow's voice was gentle. When the fever took him after the accident, your name was the one he called. Parker stood abruptly, unable to bear the conversation any longer. We should head back. There's still daylight to make use of. The ride back to the ranch was silent, each lost in private thoughts. As they approached the cabin, Parker spotted a rider coming from the direction of Florence. He tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. You expecting company? Willow asked, noticing his reaction. No, Parker replied tersely. Stay back. As the rider drew closer, Parker recognized the stout figure of Herbert Wilson, the banker from Florence. Wilson was dressed inappropriately for riding, his suit coated in dust, his face red with heat and exertion. Lawson, he called as he approached, reining in his lathered horse. Been trying to find you all day. Didn't expect to see a lady out here. He tipped his hat to Willow, curiosity plain on his sweating face. What do you want, Wilson? Parker demanded, dismounting. Wilson climbed awkwardly from his horse. It's about your note. The bank's calling it due. Parker's jaw clenched. We agreed I had until the fall roundup to make the payment. That was the agreement, yes, but circumstances have changed. Wilson mopped his brow with a handkerchief. Mr. Harding has expressed interest in acquiring this property. He's made a generous offer to the bank to take over your debt. Harding, Parker's voice was dangerously quiet. You're letting that snake try to steal my land. Now, Lawson, nobody's stealing anything. This is business. You borrowed against the property. The bank needs its money. You have 3 weeks to pay in full or will be forced to accept Mr. Harding's offer. Parker stepped closer to Wilson, his fists clenched. Get off my land. Wilson backed away nervously. 3 weeks, Lawson. That's all I can give you. He scrambled onto his horse and rode off without looking back. Parker stood rigid, watching the bankers retreat. He'd forgotten Willow's presence until she spoke from behind him. How much do you owe? He turned, his face shuddered. That's none of your concern. James would consider it my concern, she replied steadily. This was his home too. And he left it, Parker snapped, just like he left everything else. Willow didn't flinch from his anger. He left to find a way to save it. The mine was supposed to be your salvation. He was sending money back to you all along. Parker stared at her. What are you talking about? I never received any money from James. Confusion crossed her face. But he sent drafts regularly. I watched him post them myself. He was saving everything he earned to help pay off the mortgage so you wouldn't lose the ranch. Parker's mind raced, pieces falling into place. Wilson, he growled. That thieving bastard must have intercepted the payments. If you can prove it, how? It's my word against his, and in this town, a banker's word carries more weight than a scarred ex-soldier's. Parker strode toward the barn, fury radiating from every line of his body. Willow followed, catching his arm. Parker, wait. There must be records. If James sent bank drafts, there would be records at the bank in Tombstone where he drew them. Her touch stopped him. It had been so long since anyone had dared to lay hands on him in anything but anger. Her fingers were warm through the fabric of his shirt, her face earnest as she looked up at him. I'll ride to Tombstone, she continued. I know the bank manager there. He might help us. Parker pulled away from her touch, but gently. It's a 3-day ride each way. You'd never make it back in time. Then we need another plan. She followed him into the barn where he began aggressively forking hay into the horses' stalls. How much do you owe? $2,000, he admitted reluctantly. I took out the loan after a bad winter 2 years ago. Lost almost half the herd to cold and sickness. Willow's eyes widened at the sum, but she pressed on. What about the cattle you have now? Could you sell enough to cover the debt? Not in 3 weeks. The fall roundup is 2 months away. That's when the buyers come through. Then we need to find another way to raise the money. She leaned against a post, thinking. What about Lightning? A well-trained horse like that must be worth something. I'm not selling James's horse, Parker said flatly. What would James want more to save his horse or save his home? Parker slammed the pitchfork into the ground. Don't presume to tell me what my brother would want. I'm not presuming anything, she replied calmly. I'm asking you to think about what matters most. This land, this ranch, it's all that's left of your family. Are you really going to let it go without a fight? Her words hit their mark. Parker leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. What would you have me do? First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Tomorrow, I'll go into town and speak with Wilson directly. If he's been stealing money meant for you, perhaps the threat of exposure will make him reconsider. Wilson's not afraid of me. But he might be afraid of scandal, Willow pointed out. No banker wants his reputation tarnished. Parker studied her determined face, seeing for the first time what might have drawn his brother to this woman. There was steel beneath her gentle exterior. All right, he conceded, but I'm coming with you. No, she shook her head firmly. Wilson will be defensive if you're there. Let me handle this my way first. Parker wanted to argue but recognized the wisdom in her suggestion. He'd never been diplomatic that had been James's talent. Fine, he agreed reluctantly, but I don't like it. You don't have to like it, she said with the ghost of a smile. You just have to trust me. Trust was something Parker had stopped offering years ago, but as he looked at Willow's determined face, he found himself wanting to believe in someone again. The next morning, Willow rode into Florence alone, wearing her blue dress freshly washed and pressed. She'd spent the evening repairing it by lamplight, determined to present a respectable appearance at the bank. Parker had watched her nimble fingers working the needle, her brow furrowed in concentration, and felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He spent the morning in restless activity, mending tack, chopping wood, checking the cattle, anything to keep his mind from worrying about Willow's mission to town. He'd given her detailed directions to the bank and warned her about Wilson's slippery nature. "Be careful what you say," he'd cautioned as she mounted her mule. "Wilson has friends in high places." "I grew up in Richmond during the war, Mr. Lawson," she'd replied with a small smile. "I learned early how to navigate treacherous waters." Now, waiting for her return, Parker found himself drawn to James's bedroom. He hadn't entered it since showing Willow where to sleep that first night. The room was neat, the bed made with military precision, Willow's doing since Parker had left it untouched for years. A small leather-bound book lay on the nightstand. Curious, Parker picked it up. It was a journal, the pages filled with Willow's neat handwriting. He knew he should put it down, but a glimpse of his brother's name caught his eye. "James died today," the entry began, dated 3 years earlier. "The doctor says he didn't suffer long, but I saw the pain in his eyes. Before the end, he made me promise to find his brother Parker and deliver his letter." He spoke of Parker with such love and admiration. "The bravest man I know," he called him. "Too brave to admit when he's hurting." James believed his brother needed saving, though from what, he never fully explained. Only that the war had broken something in him that needed mending. Parker sat heavily on the bed, continuing to read. "I don't know how I'll fulfill this promise. The doctor bills have taken everything I had saved, and my injuries will keep me from teaching for some time. But I swore to James I would find his brother, and I will." Parker Lawson sounds like a man who has forgotten how to live. James seemed to think I could remind him. "I'm not sure anyone can do that for another person, but I owe it to James to try." Parker closed the journal, a wave of shame washing over him. He returned it to the nightstand and left the room, troubled by the glimpse into Willow's thoughts. She had kept her promise despite personal hardship, while he had failed his brother in so many ways. It was mid-afternoon when Parker heard hoofbeats approaching. He emerged from the barn to see Willow returning, her face flushed with more than just the heat of the ride. "What happened?" he asked as he helped her dismount. "Wilson is definitely hiding something," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "When I mentioned James's payments, he became very nervous. He claimed there was no record of any funds received, but he couldn't look me in the eye. Did he threaten you?" Parker demanded, noticing her agitation. "Not directly," she replied, following him to the cabin. "But he made it clear that interfering in bank business could be dangerous for a woman alone in the territory." Parker's hands clenched into fists. "I'll kill him." "That won't solve anything," Willow said firmly. "But I did learn something important. There's going to be a high-stakes poker game at the saloon tomorrow night. Wilson mentioned it to another customer while I was waiting. Apparently, some wealthy cattle buyers have arrived early, and they're looking for entertainment before business begins." "What does that have to do with us?" A hint of mischief appeared in Willow's eyes. "You told me once that before the war you were quite the card player." "James mentioned it too, said you could read a man's tells better than anyone he'd ever seen." Parker's eyes narrowed. "That was a long time ago." "Some skills don't fade," she pressed. "If you could win enough to cover the debt, gambling is what got my father killed." Parker cut her off. "I swore I'd never touch cards again." "This isn't gambling for pleasure," Willow argued. This is fighting for your home, for your and James's legacy. Sometimes we have to use the tools we have, even if we don't like them." Parker turned away from her, staring out the window at the land he'd fought so hard to keep. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. This place was all he had left of his family, of the man he'd been before the war. The thought of losing it to Harding was unbearable. "Even if I agreed," he said slowly, "I don't have the buy-in for a high-stakes game." "Actually," Willow said hesitantly, "I might be able to help with that." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my mother's. It's all I have left of her." She opened the pouch and tipped a gold locket and matching earrings into her palm. The jewelry gleamed in the fading light, obviously valuable. "I can't take that," Parker said immediately. "You're not taking it," she corrected him. "I'm investing in this ranch, in your future." In what James believed in. Parker looked from the jewelry to Willow's determined face. "Why would you do this for a man you barely know?" "Because James loved you," she said simply, "and because I made a promise." Her selflessness humbled him. After years of isolation, of pushing everyone away, this woman had walked into his life and offered help without condition. "If I do this," he said finally, "and if I win, the jewelry comes back to you first, before any debts are paid." Willow nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you." The following evening found Parker in Florence, clean-shaven and dressed in his one good shirt, preparing to enter the Silver Dollar Saloon. He'd spent the day with Willow, going over what he remembered about the local card players, strategizing how to approach the game. "Remember," Willow had said as he left, "you're not just playing for yourself, you're playing for James too." Those words echoed in his mind as he pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The place was crowded, smoky, and loud. At a table in the back, he spotted Wilson along with several well-dressed men he didn't recognize, the cattle buyers, most likely. A hand fell on his shoulder. "Well, look what crawled out of its hole." Sheriff Adams stood behind him, eyebrows raised. "Didn't expect to see you in town again so soon, Lawson, not after that brawl last week." "I'm here to play cards, not fight," Parker replied evenly. Adams looked skeptical. "See that you remember that. I've got enough trouble without you adding to it." He nodded toward a wanted poster on the wall. "Got reports of the Sutton gang operating in the area. 3 bank robberies in the last month." Parker glanced at the poster, memorizing the faces out of habit, then moved toward the bar. He ordered whiskey, nursing it slowly as he observed the high-stakes table. He needed to time his approach carefully. After an hour, one of the players, a red-faced man in an expensive suit, stood up, cursing his luck. Parker finished his drink and moved toward the vacated chair. "Mind if I join you, gentlemen?" Wilson's head snapped up, his eyes widening in alarm. "Lawson." "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, Wilson. Looking for a little entertainment." Parker pulled out the chair, his gaze steady. "This is a high-stakes game," one of the cattle buyers said, eyeing Parker's plain clothes skeptically. "Minimum buy-in is $200. Parker reached into his pocket and placed a small stack of bills on the table, along with Willow's jewelry. "Will this cover it?" The man closest to him, gray-haired with shrewd eyes, picked up the locket, examining it. "Fine piece. I'll accept it at $200. The earrings at $100 each." He looked up at Parker. "That's $500 total. You sure you want to risk this much?" "I'm sure," Parker said, taking his seat. The dealer, a professional employed by the saloon, nodded and pushed chips toward him. 5-card draw, gentlemen. Ante up." The game began. Parker played cautiously at first, reacquainting himself with the rhythm of the cards, studying the other players' habits. Wilson sweated when bluffing. The gray-haired buyer who introduced himself as Hammond tapped his fingers when holding a strong hand. The third man, Fletcher, had dead eyes that revealed nothing, but he bet aggressively on mediocre hands. An hour in, Parker had doubled his stake. Wilson was drinking heavily, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Luck of the devil," he muttered as Parker took another pot. "Not luck," Parker replied calmly. "Patience." The night wore on. Players came and went from the table, but the core group remained: Parker, Wilson, Hammond, and Fletcher. Parker's stack of chips grew steadily. He lost some hands deliberately, keeping the others interested, but won when it counted. By midnight, he had nearly $1,500 in front of him. Wilson was down to his last few chips, his earlier confidence replaced by desperate anger. "One more hand," Wilson slurred, pushing his remaining chips forward. "All in." The dealer looked to the others for confirmation. Hammond shrugged and matched the bet. Fletcher folded, lighting a cigar with practiced nonchalance. Parker studied his cards: 3 queens, a 10, and a 6. A strong hand, but not unbeatable. Wilson was drunk enough to be reckless, but there was something in his bloodshot eyes, a gleam of triumph that didn't match his desperate situation. Instinct warned Parker to fold. But he needed the money. He needed to win. "I'm in," he said, pushing forward enough chips to match Wilson's bet. The dealer looked at each player. "Cards, gentlemen." "2," Wilson said, discarding from his hand. "1," Hammond decided after consideration. Parker hesitated, then discarded the 10 and 6. "2." The dealer slid new cards to each player. Parker picked up his replacements: the Queen of Spades and the Queen of Hearts. 4 queens. His heart raced, but he kept his face impassive. Wilson smirked, examining his new cards. "Bets to you, Hammond." Hammond considered his hand, then shook his head. "Too rich for my blood." He folded, sitting back to watch the showdown between Parker and Wilson. "Well, Lawson," Wilson said with drunken bravado, "looks like it's just you and me. Care to raise the stakes? I'll put up the note on your property against your chips." Parker's eyes narrowed. "That note belongs to the bank, not you personally." Wilson waved dismissively. "As manager, I have discretion. Win this hand and I'll tear up your debt. Lose, and everything on the table is mine, including those pretty trinkets." It was a trap. Parker could sense it. But with 4 queens in his hand, the odds were strongly in his favor. Only a straight flush or 4 aces could beat him. "Deal," he said, meeting Wilson's gaze steadily. Wilson's smile widened. "Show your cards, Lawson." Parker laid down his hand, the 4 queens gleaming in the lamplight. "4 of a kind." A hush fell over the table. Wilson's smile faltered for just a moment, then returned, wider than before. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his cards on the table one by one: the 10, Jack, Queen, King, and Ace of Diamonds. "Royal flush," Wilson declared triumphantly. "I believe I win." The dealer confirmed it, and Wilson reached for the pile of chips and jewelry with greedy hands. Parker's mind raced. The odds of being dealt a royal flush were astronomical. In all his years of playing, he'd never seen one, and to appear now, when so much was at stake. "The deck is marked," Parker said quietly. Wilson froze. "What did you say?" "I said," Parker repeated, louder this time, "the deck is marked. You've been cheating." The saloon fell silent. Hammond straightened in his chair. "That's a serious accusation, Lawson." "Check the cards," Parker insisted. "The diamonds have a small nick in the corner, barely visible unless you know to look for it." The dealer, looking nervous, gathered the cards. Hammond took them from him, examining each one closely. "He's right," Hammond confirmed after a moment. "The diamonds are marked." He fixed Wilson with a cold stare. "I don't take kindly to cheats, Wilson." Wilson's face had gone from red to ashen. "I had nothing to do with it. The deck belongs to the house." The saloon owner stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Are you accusing my establishment of running crooked games, Wilson?" "No, I mean, Wilson spluttered, looking frantically around the room. Parker stood, looming over the banker. "You've been stealing from me for years, haven't you? Taking money my brother sent from Tombstone." "I don't know what you're talking about," Wilson protested weakly. "I think you do." Parker's voice was dangerously quiet. "And I think you arranged this game tonight knowing I'd stake everything to save my ranch. You made sure I'd lose." "That's absurd." Wilson staggered to his feet. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not," Hammond interjected, "but I've heard enough to know something's not right here. I do business with honest men, Wilson. If what Lawson says is true, you've broken that trust." Wilson looked around frantically, seeing nothing but suspicious faces. With a sudden movement, he lunged for Willow's jewelry still lying on the table. Parker's hand shot out, catching Wilson's wrist in an iron grip. "That doesn't belong to you," Parker growled. "Let go of me." Wilson yanked his arm free and reached inside his jacket. Parker reacted instantly, grabbing Wilson's arm as the banker pulled out a small derringer. They struggled briefly before the gun went off with a deafening report in the confined space. Wilson slumped against Parker, a look of surprise on his face. Blood bloomed on his chest, staining his white shirt crimson. The derringer clattered to the floor. "I didn't," Parker began, lowering Wilson to the ground. "It was an accident." Sheriff Adams pushed through the stunned crowd, his face grim. "Step back, Lawson." Parker obeyed, holding his hands away from his body to show he was unarmed. "The gun was his. We struggled and it went off." Adams knelt beside Wilson, checking for signs of life. Finding none, he stood and faced Parker. "Anyone see what happened?" Hammond stepped forward. Wilson drew first. Lawson was defending himself after accusing Wilson of cheating and theft. "I can't speak to the theft, but the cards were definitely marked." Several other patrons murmured agreement, having witnessed the confrontation. Adams sighed, rubbing his graying mustache. "All right, Lawson. I'm not arresting you for now, but I'll need statements from everyone, and you're not to leave town until this is sorted out." Parker nodded, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. A man was dead not by his intention, but by his hand nonetheless. And he was still no closer to saving his ranch. "The game's over," Adams declared to the room at large. "Fletcher, Hammond, I'll need statements from you both. Lawson, you come with me to my office." As Parker gathered Willow's jewelry from the table, Hammond pulled him aside. "I believe you about Wilson," he said quietly. "There's been talk about irregularities at that bank for years. Once this is cleared up, perhaps we should discuss your cattle. I might be interested in making an early purchase at a fair price." Parker looked at the cattle buyer with surprise. "I'd appreciate that. My associates and I will be in town for several days. Send word when you're free to talk business." Hammond tipped his hat and followed Adams out. At the sheriff's office, Parker gave a detailed statement about the night's events, as well as his suspicions about Wilson's theft of James's money. Adams listened without comment, making notes in his ledger. "I'll telegraph Tombstone in the morning," Adams said finally. "If there are records of your brother sending money, we'll find them. In the meantime, you're free to go, but stay available." Parker stepped out into the cool night air, exhausted by the evening's events. The town was quiet now, most citizens asleep. He considered getting a room at the hotel but decided against it. Willow would be worried if he didn't return. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, his thoughts heavy with what had happened. Wilson was dead. The ranch was still in jeopardy. And Willow, what would she think when she learned a man had died over her mother's jewelry? It was past 2 in the morning when Parker arrived home. To his surprise, a lamp still burned in the cabin window. As he dismounted, the door opened and Willow stood silhouetted against the light. "What happened?" she asked as soon as he approached. "You're so late I was worried." Parker hesitated, unsure how to explain the night's events. "Wilson's dead," he said finally, too tired for anything but the truth. Willow gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. "How?" "His own gun." There was a struggle. Parker pulled the velvet pouch from his pocket and handed it to her. "Your mother's jewelry. I didn't lose it." She took the pouch automatically, but her eyes never left his face. "Are you all right?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected accusations, fear, perhaps even for her to pack her belongings and leave. He hadn't expected concern for him. "I don't know," he admitted, the simple truth of it surprising him. Willow took his arm gently. "Come inside. You look exhausted." The cabin was warm, coffee simmering on the stove. Willow guided him to a chair and poured him a cup, adding a splash of whiskey from the bottle on the shelf. "Drink this, then tell me everything," she instructed. Parker did as he was told, the warmth of the coffee and whiskey spreading through his chest. Slowly, haltingly at first, then with more clarity, he recounted the events at the saloon. Willow listened without interruption, her expressive face registering shock, anger, and finally relief. "So the sheriff believes you," she summarized when he finished. "And this Hammond is willing to buy cattle early," Parker nodded wearily. "If his offer is fair, it might be enough to save the ranch. Adams is telegraphing Tombstone tomorrow about James's money." "That's good news, then," Willow said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Despite everything, we might find a way through this." Parker looked down at her slender fingers resting on his scarred knuckles. "A man died tonight because of me." "No," she said firmly. "Wilson died because of his own choices. His greed, his dishonesty, those are what killed him, not you." Her certainty was like a balm to his troubled conscience. Parker hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until she spoke them. "You should get some rest," Willow said, standing. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Parker caught her hand before she could move away. "Thank you for waiting up, for listening." She smiled, a gentle curve of lips that reached her eyes. "That's what friends do, Parker. Friends." The word hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Parker couldn't remember the last time anyone had called him friend. "Good night," she said softly, slipping her hand from his and moving toward James's room. Parker sat alone at the table long after she'd gone, turning over the events of the night in his mind. For years, he'd lived in isolation, convinced he needed no one. Now, in the space of a few days, this woman had walked into his life and begun dismantling the walls he'd built around himself. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as he finally sought his bed in the early hours of the morning, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years' hope. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Sheriff Adams telegraphed the bank in Tombstone and received confirmation that James Lawson had indeed sent regular payments over the course of a year. The records showed drafts totaling nearly $1,500 money that had never reached Parker's account at Wilson's bank. With Wilson's deception exposed, the bank's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Parker and Willow were summoned to Florence to meet with them. The board chairman, a silver-haired man named Donovan, offered a formal apology. "Wilson appears to have been embezzling from multiple accounts," Donovan explained gravely. "His personal ledgers show he was deeply in debt to some unsavory characters in Tucson. We believe he was using bank funds to cover his gambling losses." "And my brother's money?" Parker asked. "Diverted to Wilson's personal account," Donovan confirmed. "In light of these circumstances, the board has voted to credit your account with the full amount your brother sent, plus interest. Your loan is now considered paid in full." Relief washed over Parker. The ranch was safe. James's efforts hadn't been in vain after all. Donovan slid a bank draft across the desk. This represents the balance remaining after settling your loan, just over $500. Parker stared at the draft, then at Willow, whose eyes shone with unshed tears. "James would be so happy," she whispered. As they left the bank, Parker felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of debt that had weighed on him for so long was gone. And beyond that, his brother's faith in him had been vindicated. James had never abandoned him, had never stopped trying to help, even from a distance. "What will you do now?" Willow asked as they walked toward the livery to retrieve their mounts. Parker considered the question. With the ranch secure and some money in the bank, his immediate worries were resolved. But the future stretched before him, no longer constrained by desperation, yet somehow more uncertain than ever. "Hammond's offer for the cattle was fair," he said. "I accepted this morning before we met with the bank. That gives me enough to expand the herd next spring, maybe fix up the cabin properly." Willow nodded, but he noticed she didn't meet his eyes. "That sounds like a good plan." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, the distant mountains sharp against the clear blue sky. Parker found himself seeing the beauty of his land with fresh eyes, as if the resolution of his financial troubles had lifted a veil. At the ranch, they tended to the horses together, working side by side with the easy coordination they'd developed over the past days. Parker found himself watching Willow as she brushed down her mule, her movements graceful despite the menial task. "You never said what you'll do now," he commented, breaking the silence. Willow's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "I've been thinking about that. Now that I've fulfilled my promise to James, I should move on, perhaps back to teaching if I can find a position." The thought of her leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in Parker's chest. "There's a school in Florence," he heard himself saying. "Adams mentioned they're looking for a teacher." Hope flickered across Willow's face. "Really, that would be convenient." "You could stay here," Parker continued, the words tumbling out before he could consider them. "At the ranch, until you get settled. That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition." Parker set down his brush, turning to face her fully. "Willow, I've gotten used to having you around. The place feels less empty with you in it." It was the closest he could come to admitting how much her presence had begun to mean to him. How the sound of her voice and the light of her smile had started to heal something inside him he'd thought long dead. Willow's eyes searched his face. "Are you sure? When I first arrived, you couldn't wait to be rid of me." "Things change," he said simply. "People change." A small smile curved her lips. "Yes, they do." She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing his arm. "Thank you. I'd like to stay, at least until I find my feet." Parker covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin against his palm. "Good." That evening they celebrated their victory with a special dinner. Willow had ridden into town earlier in the week and returned with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and even a bottle of wine that now sat open on the table between them. "To James," Parker said, raising his glass, "who never lost faith." "To James," Willow echoed, her eyes soft with memory. "Who brought us together." They drank in silence, the wine rich and unfamiliar on Parker's tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal like this with anyone, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the simple table, conversation flowing easily between them. "Tell me about the war," Willow said after a while. "James never spoke of what happened to you there." Parker's hand tightened around his glass. "There's not much to tell. I fought, I survived. Many didn't." "That's not what I meant," she said gently. "James said you came back changed. That you shut yourself away from everyone who cared about you." Parker looked down, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. "The man who went to war didn't come back. Not really." What happened to him? Parker was silent for a long moment, memories he tried to bury rising to the surface. We were in Virginia. My unit was ambushed near a small creek. It was supposed to be a simple patrol, but somehow the Confederates knew exactly where we'd be. He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. I took a saber cut here, bayonet wounds to the shoulder and side. I should have died there in the mud. But you didn't, Willow prompted when he fell silent. No. I played dead until nightfall, then dragged myself back to our lines. Half my unit was gone, boys I'd promised to bring home safe. His voice roughened with emotion he'd suppressed for years. I was their sergeant. They trusted me. It wasn't your fault, Willow said softly. Tell that to their mothers, their wives. Parker drained his wine, the memories bitter in his throat. When I healed enough to return to duty, I volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Didn't care if I lived or died, but somehow I kept surviving when better men didn't. Is that why you came here? To punish yourself with isolation? The question cut too close to truths Parker had never acknowledged, even to himself. I came here because there was nothing left for me back east. James needed me. The war was over. But not for you, Willow observed. You've been fighting it ever since, alone on this ranch, turning away anyone who might care about you. Parker stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the stars sharp points of light in the black sky. You don't know what you're talking about. He heard her chair scrape as she rose, felt her presence behind him before her hand touched his back. Don't I? I lost my parents and my home to the same war. I watched my brother waste away from typhoid fever he contracted in a prisoner of war camp. I know something about carrying grief, Parker. He turned to face her, struck by the quiet strength in her eyes. How do you bear it? He asked, the question wrenched from somewhere deep inside him. How do you wake up each morning and keep going? One day at a time, she answered simply. By remembering that those we've lost would want us to live, not just survive. By finding meaning in what remains. Her hand moved from his back to his face, her fingers tracing the scar that ran from temple to jaw with a gentleness that made his breath catch. These marks don't define you, Parker. They're just part of your story. In that moment, with her touch healing something inside him he'd thought beyond repair, Parker did what he'd sworn never to do again. He allowed himself to feel. To want. To need. He kissed her. A gentle press of lips at first, hesitant after years of denying himself human connection. Willow stilled in surprise, then softened against him, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and pain dissolving in the warmth between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Parker rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, heart hammering in his chest. I shouldn't have done that, he whispered. You deserve better than a broken man. Willow's hands framed his face, forcing him to look at her. You're not broken, Parker Lawson. You're wounded. There's a difference. I don't know how to be what you need. I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself. Her smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. The rest we'll figure out together. That night, Parker slept more peacefully than he had in years, the weight of guilt and grief that had haunted him beginning to ease. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Willow humming as she moved about the kitchen. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they'd been meant to share this life all along. They worked side by side on the ranch, mending fences, tending cattle, planting a small vegetable garden that Willow insisted would supplement their meals come summer. Willow rode into Florence and secured the teaching position at the small schoolhouse. The town welcomed her warmly, grateful for an educated woman willing to take on their children. She would start when the fall term began in September. "It's only 3 miles from the ranch," she told Parker excitedly after accepting the position. "I can ride in each morning and be home by late afternoon." Home. The word lingered between them, full of promise. Parker found himself looking forward to the future in a way he hadn't for years. Each evening, they shared dinner and conversation, learning each other's stories, building something neither had dared hope for. One evening in late August, as summer's heat began to yield to the first hints of autumn, Parker took Willow riding to his favorite spot on the property, a rise overlooking the valley where the ranch lay, the mountains purple in the distance. They spread a blanket beneath an ancient juniper tree and watched the sun begin its descent. "I came here often after I first returned from the war," Parker admitted, his shoulder touching Willow's as they sat side by side. "It was the only place I felt at peace." "It's beautiful," she agreed, her hand finding his. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Parker turned to look at her, struck once again by the calm strength in her face. In the months since she'd arrived at his door, something fundamental had shifted inside him. The wounds of his past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him. With each day, with each smile, with each gentle touch, Willow had shown him there was more to life than survival. "I love you," he said simply, the words he'd thought he'd never speak again coming easily now. "I didn't think I was capable of that anymore. You proved me wrong." Willow's eyes shone with emotion. "I love you too, Parker. I think I started falling for you that first day when you stood on your porch looking so fierce and alone." Parker laughed softly. "I was trying to frighten you away." "I'm glad I'm not easily frightened." She leaned in to kiss him, a gesture that had become wonderfully familiar in recent weeks. When they parted, Parker reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the fading sunlight. "I had this made in Florence," he said, holding out a gold ring set with a small pearl. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Willow breathed, her eyes wide. "I've been thinking," Parker continued, suddenly nervous. "The cabin needs work before winter, a new roof, better windows. Maybe an extra room or two if you were planning to stay permanently." Willow's smile was radiant. "Parker Lawson, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm not doing it very well," he admitted with a rueful smile. "But yes, I want you with me, Willow, not as a guest, not as a friend, as my wife." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Parker slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steadier than he'd expected. It fit perfectly, gleaming against her skin. "James would be happy," Willow said softly. "He always wanted you to find your way back to living, not just surviving." "He sent me the greatest gift he could," Parker replied, drawing her into his arms. "He sent me you." They married 2 weeks later in Florence's small church, with Sheriff Adams as witness and most of the town in attendance. Parker wore a new suit, the first he'd purchased in years, and Willow a simple white dress she'd sewn herself. Their vows were brief but heartfelt, promises to honor and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. The celebration afterward was held at the Broken Arrow, transformed for the occasion with lanterns hanging from the trees and tables set up in the yard. Neighbors Parker had barely spoken to in years came bearing gifts and well wishes. For the first time since before the war, he found himself surrounded by community rather than isolation. As twilight deepened into night, Parker watched his new wife dancing with one of the local children, her laughter carrying across the yard. The weight he'd carried for so long had lifted, replaced by something he'd never thought to find again: happiness. Sheriff Adams approached, handing Parker a glass of whiskey. "Never thought I'd see the day," he commented, following Parker's gaze to Willow. "You're a lucky man, Lawson." "I know it," Parker agreed, raising his glass in a silent toast. "She's good for you," Adams continued. Whole towns noticed the change. Parker didn't ask what change the sheriff meant. He knew. The anger that had driven him for so long had receded, the bitterness softening into something closer to acceptance. He would always carry the scars of his past, the visible one on his face and the invisible ones on his soul, but they no longer defined him. Later that night, when the guests had departed and they were alone in the cabin that was now truly their home, Parker held Willow close, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them together. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his lips against her hair. "Completely," she assured him, her hand resting over his heart. "Are you?" Parker considered the question, searching for the truth of it. "I'm still learning what that means," he admitted. "But yes, I think I am." "Good," she murmured, reaching up to trace the scar on his face with gentle fingers. "Because you deserve happiness, Parker. You always have." In that moment, Parker finally believed her. The scars of his past would always be part of him, but they no longer had the power to separate him from life, from love. Willow had seen beyond his wounds to the man beneath, and in loving him, had made him whole again. Over the years that followed, the broken arrow flourished. Parker expanded the herd, built a larger house with a proper schoolroom where Willow could teach local children during bad weather, and gradually opened himself to friendships with neighboring ranchers. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war grew less frequent, then rare, and finally all but disappeared. Their first child, a son they named James, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Rose. Parker found in fatherhood a joy he'd never anticipated, teaching his children to ride, to respect the land, to understand the delicate balance of life in the Arizona territory. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Parker took Willow back to the rise where he'd proposed. They sat beneath the same juniper tree, watching their children play nearby, the ranch spread out below them, thriving under their care. "You ever regret it?" Parker asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Coming here, staying, taking on a scarred ex-soldier with too many demons?" Willow turned to him, the love in her eyes undimmed by years of marriage and the challenges they'd faced together. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Parker pulled her close, marveling at the journey that had brought them here from a wounded man determined to live in isolation to a husband and father embedded in family and community. The scars remained, but they had become simply part of his story, not its defining feature. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for seeing past the scars, for believing there was something worth saving." Willow smiled up at him, her hand coming to rest over his heart. "I didn't save you, Parker. I just helped you remember how to save yourself." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Parker Lawson held his family close and gave silent thanks for the woman who had walked into his life carrying his brother's letter and his own salvation, the woman who had kissed each of his wounds, visible and invisible, and called him whole.